All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We know some folks will be signing on over the next few minutes, but we're going to get started. We have a jam-packed 90 minutes planned, so we want to use every minute. And as I said, we are recording this session for folks who can't make it or for folks who will maybe want to review and look at some of the information later. We will be sharing out the recording. We will also be sharing out the slides, so don't worry about writing everything down that's on the slides. You will have access to them. Um, but welcome and thank you for joining our data webinar today. I think that all of you know Trish and I, but we're just doing a brief intro just to make sure that it's been a little while since we've gotten together. So I'm Kara Bixby from With Insight, and we've been working on this project, this expansion project with the Agenda for Children for almost a year now. It's hard to believe, but time flies. And we're moving into my favorite part of the work, which is sharing the data with you all so that you can make meaning of it with us and start to think about what actions and changes should be made based on the information. So I'm really looking forward to it. And Trish is my partner on this project, helping to lead with it. So Trish, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good to see you again. I'm Trish Tran, a partner with Kara on the consulting team to support the data and sense making and this collaborative effort with you all from the advisory group and steering committee. So we're really excited to be sharing data back in this session and looking forward to the next couple of sessions that we have in our sense making. So thank you.
So, what's exciting about today is that we are bringing together the advisory group and the steering committee, as Tris just mentioned. And we will be bringing you together over the next three sessions. And today's purpose is to really look at sharing the data that's been collected over the fall. So, we've been in the fall was really heavy data collection time. We were meeting with principals, teachers, and caregivers, doing program profile data collection. So, we have a bunch of data that you haven't seen yet. And when we get together on the 21st, we'll be really focused on making meaning of the data. But today's purpose is just to share with you what the data says. And as if you recall, our approach is participatory. So we're not going to tell you necessarily, oh, here's what we think the data means. I mean, we will tell you that if you ask us, but we want you all to be engaged in making meaning of it with us and helping to look across the data sets from the different perspectives. So today is sort of this data dump of going through all the different information that we collected and sharing that with you. And then on the 21st, when we come together, we'll have really in-depth conversation about the data. This is just a reminder of the process that we've undertaken. Oops, sorry. This is a reminder of the process that we've undertaken over this past year. A big piece of the work is engaging stakeholders, as I talked about, is that participatory process. We've been in this data collection mode of conducting the gap analysis. And throughout the process, we've been meeting with the steering committee and the advisory group to share data and make meaning as we go. And you all have already started work on generating strategies and solutions. And this is a really big data dump of all of the data that was collected in the fall. This is going to be an opportunity to then refine that through the process, refine those strategies, refine those solutions to inform the next step, which is really putting the recommendations together in a report. And I do just want to say that in the report, the voices of the different stakeholder groups will be strategically and methodically woven together in a way that protects anonymity, privacy of the individuals, making sure that that individuals aren't identified in the data, but we do want to be able to show where there are common themes across stakeholders and then where there may be differences as well. So that's just a reminder of the approach we've taken. And one of the core pieces that has guided us through this work is what we've been calling the study questions. And there are a bunch of them, and there's been a lot that we've been trying to learn throughout the process. But these are ultimately what guide the data that we collect and the ways and the methods that we use to collect the information. And so you can see there are questions related to the workforce. We know that's core to expansion. We have several questions related to caregivers and families' perspectives and needs. We need to know about capacity. Where is their supply? Where is their potential for expansion or additional space? Funding is a core piece to being able to expand, so trying to understand more about that element. And then really wanting to know, because this project is really about systems change, really wanting to know more about root causes. So what are the perceptions of the different stakeholder groups? What are the values and constraints of the system? And what are those policies and procedures that we can maybe leverage to make change happen? So those root cause questions have also been a part of the work that we've done. And from those questions came the data collection that we've done over this past year. And so we split it up into what's called primary data collection and secondary data collection. So primary data collection is data that we collected specifically for this project. Secondary data collection is data that was collected for another purpose or already existed that we're leveraging and using to inform this project. So the ones that are highlighted in yellow, those data sources, are the data sources that we are going to talk about today. So those are the ones we're going to share with you. Some of this data you've already seen. For example, the frontline youth worker focus groups, that was a big piece that we did over the summer. Um, some of the waitlist and enrollment data you've seen already. We did that in the September meeting. So we've been looking at some of this data as we've been going. We are doing a big review of the data that was collected today. But I did want to just point out that if you're wondering, well, where's the youth program perspective or where's the youth worker perspective? It's not that we're not, it will be included in the report and the meaning making session when we get together in January. We're just not going over it today because we really only have time to focus on the new data that you haven't seen yet. Um, the other thing I just want to say too is that in this deck, this PowerPoint deck, at the end, we have an appendix where we included all the data that we've previously shared so that it's all in one place. So when we send this out, if you want to be able to reference that, it is all going to be put together in this deck for you to be able to reference. It's just at the end of this PowerPoint. The other thing, so we're going to do a transition. We're going to actually shift into sharing the data. But before we do that, I do want to say we have a lot to go through. So unfortunately, we don't have the time to stop and do questions. That would be the ideal, is to stop and go do questions and talk about the data as we go. But we don't have time. So if you have questions that come up, please use the chat and type those questions in, because that will be really helpful for us to know where we need clarity or what's not, where people maybe want some additional information. So if you can put your questions in the chat, if we have time at the end, definitely we will answer them. If not, we will use them to help clarify what we need to address in our next in-person meeting on the 21st. And also, it's just helpful for us to know as we go into the report to know what's making sense to people and where there's additional questions. So yes, feel free to use the chat as we go. So we are going to dive in. The first source of data that we're going to look at is the program profiles, and we're going to focus first on the workforce data. So the program profiles were administered through a survey, and they were sent to all 5-day-a-week nonprofit and DHS programs, and they were completed by directors. We had 28 programs complete the program profiles. This happened in August and September, so right as the school year was kicking off. And one thing to remember as we go through this data, it's retrospective. So it's looking at the school year 23-24. We're in the middle of a school year right now, so the data mid-year isn't a full data set. So we're looking at last year. It's the most recent full data set we have. So 23-24 is the data that we're going to be sharing out in the program profiles. And of the 28 programs, 6 of them were nonprofits and 22 were DHSP programs. Okay, so we're going to start out looking at employment data. So this first graph looks at how many frontline staff, by the way, this is frontline staff, how many frontline staff the program's budgeted for, and then how many frontline staff they employed in 23-24. So you can see it's broken down by the number of hours, and a lot of these graphs are going to break it up by 19.5 hours or less, 20-29, and then 30 or more hours per week. We're generally using the 30 or more hours per week as sort of the full-time definition for this data set. And as you look, you can see that the thing that sort of stands out the most in this graph is the gap between the employed and budgeted for the 19.5 hours a week or less. And you can see that there were fewer people employed than budgeted for. And part of that reason was that there were vacancies. So there were spots for those very part-time positions that were unable to be filled. We also asked programs to report what their projections were, looking ahead at this year. And most programs said that their staffing levels were going to stay the same. Four did project an increase and one projected a decrease. But across the board, the majority of programs said that their staffing was going to stay the same for this year. So here we also asked not only about how many staff they budgeted for employed, but also how many staff were retained from the previous year, how many spots were vacant, and how many people left. So to just give you a little bit of detail of what we mean by that. So a retention rate is saying of the staff that you had and that were employed in 23-24, how many did you retain from the prior year? How many came from also worked the prior year, school year? And you'll see that retention rates are pretty good across the board. And they actually are interestingly highest for the 19.5 hours or less is where we're seeing some of the highest retention rates from that year. So from 22-23 to 23-24. The vacancy rates are positions that were never filled. So even throughout that whole year, those budgeted positions that by the end of the year didn't have anyone employed in them. So you can see for the vacancy rate that 19.5 hours also was had a high vacancy rate. So the people who were in the position, there's a subset of people who seem like they were retained and they want to stay in that position, but there's also those positions are also hard to hire for in general, is another thing. And then the attrition rate is the final rate where it says left, and that's someone who left mid-year, so they didn't stay throughout the whole full year. And if you look at the attrition rate, the highest is in the 20 to 29 hours per week. So you'll see it's at 44%, which is pretty high. But looking at the full-time, what we're sort of calling full-time positions, the 30 or more hours per week, you'll see that the vacancy rate and the attrition rate are very low for those full-time positions. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention, sorry. We also asked people about the length of vacancies, and we asked for the different types of positions, full-time, part-time, and really across the board, they were generally similar. We didn't see any significant differences in the data across full-time and part-time positions for the length of vacancies. And the length of vacancies on average was about the 2 to 3 month period. So, I think that's pretty typical for how long it takes to hire these days, if not longer. Um, so we also asked staff to look ahead. Now, granted, remember, this is being filled out in August and September, so this is sort of right around hiring and launching of programming for this year. But we said, looking ahead to 24-25, how concerned are you about staffing shortages? And you can see a little over 2/3 of people were either very concerned or moderately concerned, the majority in the sort of moderate category. But staffing shortages are something that people have concerns about in this going into this school year. And then we also asked about wages. So this is called the bee swarm graph. And instead of just showing a range, this graph actually shows you some of the individual data points to show where there's some grouping. And so the idea here is to show you, okay, yes, we can see the lowest wage and the highest wage. And by the way, so we had the programs report for each of their programs. They reported the lowest wage for their frontline staff that are full-time and part-time, and then the highest wage. So these are actual wages that people received in 23-24. One thing to note is we don't know how many people received each of these wages. It's just their highest wage and their lowest wage. So that's just something to note. These dots represent program reports, so not people. It's a little confusing, but they represent the salaries reported by the program. So an individual dot is a program. But the highest wage for full-time frontline staff across the programs was $30 and the lowest was 18. And you can see here with this B swarm, if I had just shown you the range, you wouldn't necessarily know this, but this $18 looks like somewhat of an outlier because you can see where the salaries actually um, tend to be more in a cluster here. And then for part-time, the highest is 25 and the lowest is 18. And you can see for part-time, there actually are some clusters down here with lower wages. So the lowest wage is actually comparable across the two. But when we were looking sort of at where people are falling on average, full-time positions have higher wages and then also just a higher maximum wage in general. We also wanted to see what increases look like for wages, and so we asked programs what whether the wages have changed over the last 2 years. And across the board, in general, the majority of programs they had stayed the same. Now, Agenda for Children does these program profiles on a regular basis. So they had done them 2 years prior, and they had had the same question and had reports that the 2 years prior, there were significant wage increases. So during COVID, we did see a big bump in wages. However, in this data, we're seeing that the majority of the wages are staying roughly the same. There are some programs that are increasing, but that's the minority. We also asked people how confident they feel in maintaining wage increases, and most programs did say that they feel pretty confident maintaining them into the future. The DHSP programs did report slightly higher confidence in general in being able to maintain those wages. So we asked programs, what do you think are the top barriers to recruitment? And if you'll remember, we actually asked the frontline youth workers this as well. So this will be something when we make meaning of the data to be able to compare across the data sets. What were programs' perceptions, and then what were the youth workers' perceptions of this? Um, but the top three recruitment barriers that came out in the data from the program profiles were compensation level as number one, positions not being full-time, and also not being able to provide benefits. And when we looked at the benefit data, um, full-time positions have many of the benefits we asked about, but part-time positions, really the only benefits that are offered to the majority of part-time positions are paid sick time and tuition support. Otherwise, part-time positions on average don't have access to benefits. So that is probably a challenge to recruiting for some of those positions. And then we asked about top reasons for leaving, and the most common response was unknown. We actually don't know, which maybe speaks a little bit more to the need to do exit interviews. And we know that not everyone is always honest in the exit interviews, but trying to understand um, the reasons why people leave. But other themes that rose to the top were compensation level and then positions not being full time. Two of the recruitment challenges as well, seen as sort of reasons for exiting. Okay. That is the workforce data. And now I'm going to hand it over to Trish, and Trish is going to talk about the capacity side of the data from the program profiles.
Thanks, Kara. And so this is still from Programs Profile. So we're looking at 2023 and 2024 data, primarily looking at the number of seats that programs budgeted and had capacity for. So in 2023, 27 5-day per week programs budgeted for 1,953 seats. And the average program had 70 seats with so you can see that on the left there, 70 seats budgeted with the max seats a program had was 220 and the smallest program had 18 seats and the average student to teacher ratio was 10-1, so under that minimum. Next slide. So while programs budgeted for 1,953 seats, they served a total of 2,000 86 students, and over half were in grades K through 3. And the difference you see in that budgeted of 1,953 seats versus the total of 2,86 students served, that difference there is because of slot sharing of seats, or there was of those seats with turnover of those seats um, throughout the year. So I was getting like trying to read what was happening in the chat
Oh, that's
too.
just me, Trish. I was just making a
Yeah.
comment. No worries.
Yeah. Next slide. And so also in 2023, 2024, 5-day a week program served 41% of CPS students in pre-K through 8. So that's 2,086 out of 5,056, with again a higher percentages in those early grades, K through 4. Next slide. And so many programs had a wait list, and the reasons for having a wait list due to program capacity um, or insufficient staffing to be able to um, fully have all of their seats available. Also, part-time availability that opens up doesn't meet families' needs. So maybe some slots opened up, but they were only for 1 or 2 days a week, but a family needed 5-day a week care. How spots are offered. For DHSP, they use a lottery system based on lottery number, priority status, and grade. And so priority status is based on income. So 30% of seats at each site are reserved for priority applicants. And what happens is applicants are divided into priority versus general groups. And so a random lottery number is given to each of these groups and selected that way. Um, for nonprofit programs, they prioritize need based on income primarily, as well as availability in the age bracket or the classroom, as well as first come, first serve. Next slide. 7 programs projected their number of seats would increase for the 2024-25 school year, and that was estimated to be about an additional 108 students across the system. So 7 programs were expecting to increase their number of seats, so that's where that 108 comes from, and 21 programs were expecting to stay the same. Next slide. Um, Programs reported that hiring staff or having not enough space served as moderate to significant barriers to serving more students. Next slide. And then programs reported that retaining staff, transportation, and challenging enrollment processes were only slight barriers to serving more students. So they didn't see that these issues were major barriers to increasing capacity. Next slide. 93% of programs have a policy for how to support students with special needs. Next slide, please. Programs generally share a consensus that they don't have the resources and capacity to support all of their students with special needs. DHSP programs have staff that are dedicated to supporting students with special needs. About 30 DHSP staff across all sites are dedicated to serving students with special needs, and nonprofits do not have dedicated staff. Programs support staff through PD development, professional development, and information sharing about student needs. Next slide. And this slide just summarizes sort of what we just talked about, thinking about the need and demand. In the 2023-24 school year, there were 4,513 students in K-8, so that's really that range that we're looking at in this study. We're including that 543 pre-K students just in this figure, just to show that there are students who are sort of outside of that that scope that have a need for care as well. 2,455 expressed a desire for a seat in a 5 day per week program in the previous school year. Um, but there were only 1,953 available seats, and overall, 2,086 students were enrolled in a 5 day a week program. And so that means that 369 did not get a seat. Something that we want to explore more in the upcoming section is really the principal, teacher, as well as caregiver perspectives, particularly about need as well as the capacity around physical space sharing and program and teachers' ability to meet the needs of different students.
Okay, great. So now we will talk about the teacher's perspective. And we did focus groups and a survey. So, as with focus groups, you have a smaller group. We had 5 teachers who participated across 3 virtual focus group sessions in November. And then we had 59 respondents that completed the teacher survey, which was administered in November and December. Just to give you a sense of who participated, I'm going to be presenting both teachers and principals, and across teachers and principals, every single school was represented by at least one individual. So we were really happy to see that there was consistent representation across schools. And then when we asked folks who filled out the survey what type of teacher they were, these were the responses that we got. So over half are classroom teachers, and the other category is primarily made up of specialists, so art, music, phys ed teachers. And that is interesting to note because I think that specialist spaces are often one of the areas that's shared with after school most commonly. So one of the things we really wanted to know is just how are they interacting with after school programs? And what was interesting is that the most common way that the survey respondents are interacting with after school programs is that they're actually communicating with after school staff about students. So that's a pretty intensive, more in-depth type of interaction compared to some of the others that we could imagine or that are on this list. And so the folks who are responding to this for the most part are people who have a little bit more in-depth interaction with after school programs. Now, granted, there are still 9 that haven't interacted with school programs, but the majority have had some level of interaction, and over half of them in a more in-depth way. We asked people there was a write-in where they could write what other meant, and other was actually some staff work in after school, so they are have jobs in after school, or they have partnered with after school programs to provide a programming or an event, or they've actually worked collaboratively together with after school programs. And so based on those interactions, we wanted to know from folks what the relationship has been like. And so we asked them to describe their relationship with after school programs. And the vast majority of them said it was either somewhat or very positive. We had 2 responses that had somewhat negative, and they seem like very isolated incidents, like having a negative interaction with the program. But overall, people really felt very positive about their interactions with after school. And the positivity also shows up in their perspective on the role of after school. So 88% of teachers who completed the survey reported that after school programs are very valuable to their students. And you can see when we coded the open-ended data, the ways that they see after school adding value for young people are things obviously like safe place and childcare, but academic support and homework help, enrichment activities, really opportunities to explore some of their interests, and access to opportunities that aren't able to be provided during the school day. Things that they aren't able to do during school, they're able to explore and learn more about in after school. And then they also talked about skill development, so practicing and learning new skills. And I thought this quote was a good quote to share some of the themes that came up about a teacher who described the goals of after school are obviously from a family perspective for childcare so that a parent can work, but also to introduce students to a lot of opportunities that they might not have during the school day. When we asked teachers about their challenges when with interacting with after school, the top challenge was around space and space sharing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next couple slides. Some other challenges that came up were just the lack of a structured opportunity in those formal connection points between after school staff and school day staff, and really wanting some more intentional time for that. Um, One of the barriers they talked about to that relationship building and that communication is just high turnover of OST staff. So if there's always a new person, it's just, start over again with that relationship building and building those communication venues. Um, uh, One or two teachers talked about the lack of clarity on a program's intended approach to supporting academics, and I think this was a example that some programs uh, or the perception of programs is sometimes that they are for more intentional academic support. And what the teachers described is that what they saw happening in the program was more of like a homework help and just wanting to have more clarity on understanding what the purpose of the program is and what's being delivered. So that was a challenge that was brought up from a few people. And then another thing that was brought up more consistently was just wanting after school programs to be able to effectively serve students with special needs. So I'm going to go into space sharing a little bit since that was sort of the core challenge that came up. And we know it's really important to being able to increase seats. And so, when asked about space sharing challenges or barriers, teachers just talked about maintenance and cleanliness, really wanting their room to be in order when they come in and spending time, having to spend time cleaning it up after school programs. Um, the other challenge was teachers talking about needing to work in their space. So whether it's for conferences or prep time or an event that's going on, sometimes needing their space, and especially in the middle school level or the upper school level, oftentimes there are clubs after school in the upper grades, and so that is also a challenge in terms of finding space. A few folks said, "Oh, my space just isn't really conducive to running programming. It's really small." But that was sort of just a small minority of people. So I think this is a quote that kind of gets at this notion that, or this idea that teachers just um, need to spend extra time to restore their room, and that's something that is just a challenge when doing space sharing. In the survey, we asked how many people currently share their classroom, and a fourth of people, about 24%, currently share their classroom. But when we asked about how open they are to sharing their classroom in the future, over half were open. And in our conversations with people in the focus groups and in the survey data, we did see that there is openness to sharing, and teachers are open. They just are asking that certain conditions are met, and they want to have agreements in place to make sure that there are clear expectations on the way that the room should be put back together and cleaned up, and then also having someone to talk to if something doesn't um, go as planned, who they can turn to and have a conversation with. So just really a clear process and expectations for how that happens. But otherwise, they seem open to those who aren't currently sharing do seem open to sharing their classroom in the future. They also talked about a desire for more collaborative decision making on how space sharing happens. So one of the things we learned, and I'll talk about this more when it gets to the principal side, is there's not really a clear process for how decisions get made about space. And it's definitely differs building by building, and there really isn't a lot of formality behind it. Um, and so there is a desire from the teacher perspective to have more clarity and also just more of a collaborative decision-making process. And as I talked about, sometimes they need space after school, so that's a consideration that needs to be thought about. And then the other comment, this was in a few specific sites where the after school program has its own dedicated space. And a few teachers talked about how it was empty during the school day. and they needed space to do interventions or one-on-one meetings, and they aren't allowed, according to what they shared, to use that space during the school day, even though it's open. So they talked about how space sharing should go both ways and be something that is talked about and worked on from both perspectives. And this is a quote from one of the teachers. I think it's helpful to see this reframing that, um, your classroom is a shared resource and the purpose of it is to benefit all kids. And so I think this quote helps get at some of that reframing that might need to happen. And then finally, this quote I think really summed up a lot of what we heard from folks is when there's a relationship and there's communication, people are open to space sharing and it goes much better. And so this quote is a teacher that has had a very positive experience with space sharing, and she attributed it to the fact that she's had a positive relationship with the folks in her space. So we asked the teachers that we talked to what their recommendations and ideas are for not just space sharing, but for their all the challenges in general and for expansion. And they talked about how they really want to improve communication. And part of that is just knowing more about what's going on in programming, but also communications about how students are doing and communications about um, what programming looks like. Um, the one idea that came up was about shared training. So a number of teachers talked about wanting to have shared behavioral expectations for students and sort of shared norms that are used both during the school day and after school, and some shared training across teachers and after school staff could be a really nice way to make that happen. Strategic collaboration was brought up by a handful of folks, and this is people who are interested in some of this more deeper work, where actually means getting together and doing more formalized strategy and planning together. So this wasn't everyone, but this is a subgroup of people that are really interested in doing more and helping to inform what happens after school and have more of that collaborative relationship. Someone brought up celebrating achievements together, and I think that this is a really something we don't always remember about celebration. Sometimes we're always so focused on problem solving, and I think celebration can be a way to develop relationships and to honor the work that after school and school day folks are doing. So that I thought that was a really neat suggestion that people brought up. Um, Providing more offerings, so they want to see just more after school and also more spots for young people so that teachers recognize that that was also an issue. They're seeing students that aren't able to be served. And specifically, they brought up that students with special needs. So there were some teachers that are special education teachers, and they talked about their students being unable to get spots or being unable to be served because of the level of support that they require, and wanting to have this be something that we can collaboratively solve and figure out how do we effectively serve students with special needs and make sure that they can be a part of after school. Um, One of the staff members worked specifically with homeless students, students and families in shelters. And this teacher talked about how oftentimes those shelters aren't located in Cambridge. And for those students to attend after school, they need transportation. So that was another barrier that was specifically brought up for a specific group of students. And then another idea that came up several times was just rotating space sharing. So having space sharing be something that it's not the same teachers every single year, but it's something that rotates so that it's fair and everyone has an opportunity to do it. So I think one of the core themes that came out across teachers was just the need for relationship building and how that improves being able to work together better and share space. And so this is a quote just saying that relationship building would be a recommendation to consider in terms of moving forward. It also includes this mindset shift that so they're seen as our kids, all of our kids, which is another theme that's come out throughout the teacher data. Okay, so then we also talked to principals. And we held two virtual focus groups in November. We had 8 participants in total. There were 6 from elementary schools and 2 from upper schools. Um, and we asked principals, similar to teachers, what are their interactions with after school look like? And as the administration, they have more interaction with the program directors and often about student needs or planning what programming is going to look like for the year. So they're, at a different level than teachers are at. They also talked about they have having st shared staffing. So sometimes there are situations where after school staff are actually coming in earlier in the day and working with students in the classroom before they transition to after school. And then there are also some staff like paraprofessionals, for example, that are employed by the school, but then also work in after school. So that shared staffing is another element of the way that principals work in after school or work with after school programs. And then data sharing and student tracking, figuring out what students are being served by after school and doing some of that data sharing with after school programs. So we also asked principals some of the same questions we asked teachers to describe their relationship with after school programs, and 100% described them as either very or somewhat positive. You can see 50% somewhat positive and 50% very positive. One of the themes is just the relationship that they've been able to build. The stronger the relationship, the more positive the experience that they've had. And across the board, 100% of the principals who participated said that after school programs are very valuable for their students. And you can see here, these themes reflect many of the same themes that came across with teachers. The value that they see that after school is adding is that they're able to extend learning in after school. They have access to enrichment activities. They're able to engage with a diverse group of folks. So not only their peers, but also across age groups. It's obviously a safe, caring place where families have access to childcare. And then they talked about just access to new opportunities that they don't have otherwise, very similar to what the teachers shared, and opportunity to practice the skills that they're learning during the school day. And this is a quote from one of the principals that just reflects that students are able to extend their learning through different enrichment activities, and it's so crucial for students' development. So we also asked principals about the challenges that they've had in working with after school programs. And one of the major challenges is being able to find common time to work together. So the school day and after school schedule and the demands on their time make it challenging to have that common time to get together and that structured communication and planning. So this is very similar to what some of the teachers shared as well. They also talked about out of school time staff turnover and how it's hard when there's a new staff member. It feels like the relationship building starts over again. The principals talked about there not being enough spots, wanting to make sure that any student or family that wants it can participate and being able to make more spots available for students. A theme that came up too was that they talked about their families missing deadlines. So when the deadline of the application and process is often so much in advance of the school year that families often aren't thinking about programming and signing up for programming that early. Or if a family moves in the summer or comes mid-year, there aren't spots. The spots have likely already been given away, and so that's also a challenge. And they talked about is there a way for us, because those students often tend to be very mobile students and students who are more vulnerable. So is there a way for us to have a strategy to help have spots for those students when they come mid-year or when they miss some of those deadlines? And then principals also discuss serving students with special needs, and related to that, just the varying levels of training for out of school time and the quality of out of school time staff that they've experienced looking across different programs. So this is a quote, sorry. This is a quote here, just emphasizing the need that even though there's a lot of programs, we still don't have enough seats. So we asked principals how open they are to expanding after school space at their school, and everyone who responded was said they were either very open or somewhat open. And the folks who said they were somewhat open were in their open-ended comments just explained it's more just about the context of the space. So, for example, some have upper grades that have different dismissal times that make it challenging or something else that's going on in the space. But there's definitely willingness across all of the principals that participated to figure out how to increase space sharing. We also asked how decisions about space are made. And what we learned from the conversations is that there's a lack of clarity around how decisions are made, and it really does vary building by building. And from what we heard, there really is no formal structure or process for the decision making about space. What we did see in the data is that when there are strong relationships and partnerships, there tend to be more positive experiences related to space. But there really isn't a consistent or formal way that that's happening across schools. So we ask principals what their recommendations and ideas are, and I think these recommendations and ideas, they do in somewhat parallel what teachers said, but they are also have a different perspective from the administration level. They're a little bit more about systems. So they are open to pooling financial and human capital resources. They're open to things like staff sharing and really thinking creatively about how to better meet student needs and serve more students. They also said that it would be great to have a more streamlined modes of communication. There's a lot of providers. So thinking about how we have communication, especially at some school sites that work with have students that attend a variety of programs and work with a number of different providers. They really did, similar to teachers, emphasize the importance of the close after school relationships. They want to work together to figure out how we can ensure staff are trained and qualified to support students with special needs. Um, and they talked about just designated meeting time, figuring out, despite the challenges of schedules, how do we have designated meeting time for people to get together and plan and work together? And then finally, some of the principals talked about just compensation and benefits, which we know from the workforce data are challenges, and how to increase compensation and provide benefits for out of school time staff. And this here is a quote that I think emphasizes the desire to be collaborative. So we haven't quite figured out how to support students with special needs in out of school time fully. So how can we work together to make that happen so that they can access those opportunities? So I just have two slides here to summarize, because there's a lot across principals and teachers, sort of summarize some of the themes here. But a lot of what they shared was common, and there were a lot of common themes that came up. Principals and teachers see the value in out of school time. They think it's really important, and they talked a lot about the same benefits together. Um, and when we asked about what makes a successful partnership, how could you partner better? They had a lot of the same themes as well around positive relationship building, proactive communication, that time to work together, to really focus on what student needs are and be collaborative in that process, and just make sure that there are structured ways to do that level of partnership. So that is the summary from principals and teachers, and I will pass it off to Trish, who will go through the caregiver data.
Yeah, so this next section is about caregiver perspectives, and we asked families, basically how they make decisions about after school, how they weigh their options, how they prioritize selecting a program, what are barriers to access, and from their perspective, to what extent are OST programs meeting the needs of all children, and the impact of not having after school on their family and on their child. So we conducted focus groups in November and December, and we had 43 caregivers participate over 7 sessions, and 3 of these sessions were language specific that were held and facilitated in Amharic, Haitian Creole, and Spanish. And these are because these are, other than English, the most prominently spoken languages. Um, so these are the different focus group sessions. Caregivers with children with special needs, caregivers who identify as Black or Brown, caregivers with children on wait lists who are not currently enrolled, and caregivers with low or lower income, and then the 3 language specific. So we had 43 caregivers participate across these 7 focus groups, and we asked caregivers as they participate and share their experience, really share their experience through these different lenses. Next slide. So an overwhelming majority of caregivers identified as a person of color. And you'll see here that 30% who prefer to self-identify. A lot of folks wrote in as Latino, Latina, or Haitian. So you might expect that Black or African ancestry or Hispanic Latino ancestry to be a little bit higher than what is specifically there. So that 30% folks wanted to be more specific. Next slide. So most of their children were enrolled in kindergarten or the lower elementary grades. So 42% of participants had a child in kindergarten, and then another 23 and 35% had children in second or third grade, with fewer caregivers having children in the upper elementary or middle school grades. Next slide. Nearly all caregivers had 1 or 2 children in their household who were enrolled in K-8. So 52% had 1 kid, 1 child in K-8, and then 44% had 2 children in K-8. There was only 4% of caregivers who had 4 children. So most or all had 1 or 2 children only. So this slide is a little bit more complicated. So a majority of families with 2 or 3 children have either no children enrolled, so that's that pinkish color, or only some of their children enrolled, and that's that orange color. Um, so 42% of families with 2 children either had none of their children enrolled, and 33% of families with 2 children only had some of their children enrolled. So that means like maybe 1 kid was enrolled and another wasn't. And then 100% of families with 3 children had only 1 kid enrolled, but the other 2 were not enrolled, or 2 enrolled and 1 wasn't. So it wasn't their needs were not fully met. So in this next slide, this caregiver shares that their top priority is having both kids in after school. Currently, one is in after school and the other is not. And so, from their perspective, it's actually even worse than not having any after school, because they essentially have to do pickup twice for that particular kid and still having to watch 1 child. And so, on top of that, they're a single parent, so it's just very logistically difficult for them. Next slide, please. So caregivers spoke of the many benefits of having after school, both for the children and for themselves. Several folks mentioned just that double benefit. For the benefits for the child, is, that academic support, having that homework help and repetition and exposure to reinforce what they learn in school. Many people spoke about that social interaction and social development, being able to play and learn and interact with kids their own age. And there was an example where a caregiver shared that their kindergartner was very, very shy, but after going to after school just for a couple of months, they become so much more expressive at home with, their parents and grandparents, playing with the younger sibling, and also at school getting a lot of positive feedback from the teacher. Um, Caregivers felt it was really important to have that schedule where they get exposure to a variety of activities and have an outlet for their energy after school, but also a space for that social interaction and physical activity before they come home. And getting that routine of getting into the routine of doing homework after school instead of just coming straight home and getting distracted playing with their siblings, or what many caregivers talked about was, anything to get them away from more screen time. So in after school means having after school means that they're not spending as much time on screens, which some people admitted, um, and feeling guilty about is that was sometimes something that they would default to because they were so tired or didn't have the time. For benefits for the caregiver side, after school allows them to work. It helps reduce their stress and supports their mental health, knowing that their kids are in a safe place, that their kids are getting homework help. And it takes off that burden again, that burden and guilt again, when they're too tired after work to plan additional activities or provide that after school support. Um, and this is especially important for working and single caregivers, and caregivers whose primary language isn't English. That English acquisition was really important for those families. Next slide. And so this is a longer quote, so I'll just summarize that this caregiver shared that being around other primary English speakers in after school helped improve their child's English, which helped their child be better connected in the school experience. And they felt that that extra academic exposure after school was really important. Next slide. Um, we asked caregivers about the impact of not having access to after school, and so you'll see some of these themes are sort of mirroring the opposite of the benefits. So again, the impact on their ability to work and the economic stability. Some folks have talked about, sacrificing their career. They're just not working at all or having to go from full-time to part-time in order to cover for that after school care. Um, Not having after school care also increased their stress and mental health, not being able to work, having to just take on so much more. And then again, that educational support and equity, again, especially for caregivers whose primary language isn't English, or lower income families who don't have the flexibility at work, where they're not able to get that supplementary educational support needed outside of school that maybe more resource families are able to offer at home. And then again, that impact on child development and social skills, fewer opportunities to socialize or develop those critical social skills in that structured environment. And again, routine and structure, more support with homework, building that, habit, and less screens. Next slide, please. And so this is a quote from a single parent without any help nearby. And they express that, if it weren't for public agencies and resources, it would just be very difficult for them. Next slide, please. We asked about barriers and talked about challenges with after school that caregivers expressed. So a big thing was communication and information access. Caregivers expressed a desire for having all information about after school, the timeline, enrollment, and different options in a centralized place. Folks express, getting lots of emails or flyers was really confusing for them to sort through information and options. Um, there were definitely several folks who cited Find It Cambridge as a helpful tool, although there was one person who felt that there was not enough information about after school and Find It Cambridge, but that the resource fair at their school was really helpful for them. So just a variety of different modes of communication and getting information, but in a centralized kind of place. They also express a desire for receiving communication and reminders through multiple channels. So some caregivers felt that they were technologically challenged and preferred to receive notices and forms through their kids' backpack. And then there was also a suggestion that schools could send direct links to forms and reminders about timelines and enrollment timelines through text messages to make it more direct and easier for them to fill out forms. Um, there were also a lot of caregivers who received information about after school through their family and friend networks, so through word of mouth, um, or through their family liaisons. And this was especially true for caregivers whose primary language was not English. And so, though, for those caregivers who work with family liaisons, they expressed having a relatively smooth application process in which the family liaison was really helpful in getting that enrollment, the application completed for them. Another prominent theme or barrier or challenge was application timeline. People really wanted timely reminders about the application deadlines. Some folks felt like they sort of didn't really realize the deadline was coming up. They were left scrambling to apply. Um, and so, several other caregivers expressed the importance of timely communication regarding program enrollment and eligibility. And specifically for those whose kids have an IEP, there was just a lot more difficulties with the notification. And one shared that, they were notified that their child was enrolled, but they found out at the last minute, a few days before the program was about to start, that their enrollment was contingent on whether the child needed an aid. And so, if that notification came earlier and if the determination came earlier, they could have made alternative arrangements or at least not be caught off guard. Um, and so while summer programming is out of scope for this project, there were a few caregivers who felt that notifications about summer enrollment could be sent out earlier in the school year to allow for them to have more adequate time for planning. There were some challenges with the application process. So caregivers expressed some frustration with particularly the need for in-person assistance. They felt that, um, it was challenging to upload documents online. Some people wanted to be able to just go to a place, give them their documents, and know that it was done because they either just had trouble with a computer or maybe they didn't have a printer. Um, so they just really want to be able to go somewhere, give them the forms, and know it was done. Other caregivers who, were more technically uh, savvy may not have had challenges with applying online, but what they expressed frustration was not getting confirmation that their application was accepted, and so that left them, waiting or unsure about their status. Another theme was about program availability and wait lists. So, several caregivers wanted to know where they were on the wait list, so that they could at least, gauge their chances of whether or not their child would get in. Were they sort of one or two? Were they nine, 10, right? So they just wanted to get a better sense of, where they were on the wait list, so they could make alternative arrangements if needed. Um, and there was also some frustration that, when you made alternative arrangements and you got off the wait list, maybe you might have made a deposit and you would have lost that money. Or with students who are coming in mid-year, or if they get a spot mid-year, then they've already settled into a routine with their kids and they found that somewhat challenging, even though they were happy to get a spot. Another theme was about mid-year enrollment and new students. A few caregivers were not able to enroll their kids either as a mid-year transfer to the district or as a new student to the school because there was preference for returning students. Cost was also a barrier that prevented families from enrolling their children in programs. The folks also shared that the financial application process for scholarships was a little bit cumbersome with, what they felt like were intrusive questions, or it was difficult for them to apply and provide all this extra information to get that financial assistance. And then transportation was also another big challenge for working caregivers whose kids did not attend a co-located program, especially. So those caregivers with multiple children who had only one kid enrolled in after-school program experienced a lot of logistical issues as well, having to do pickup twice. So having transportation would have really helped them as well. Um, Early dismissal times increase the demand, and so carriers also express that, the scare the there was an increase in demand in out of school time programming because of those early dismissals. All right, next slide. And so third, we asked about how caregivers got their kids from school to their after school program, and just over a third, 38% of children take the school bus to their after school program. Um, 70% either mainly walked their kids from school to after school, and they were able to do that because they lived close to school. And then 70% were not enrolled in an after school program, and 17% didn't need sort of transportation because the program was co-located, so that uh, school bus transportation is really helpful and important. Next slide. So just a couple of quotes. This is about communication. So wanting information to be sent home via backpack. So this is in the teal. And then in the pink, timely reminders, wanting timely reminders because caregivers aren't necessarily thinking about after school for the following year as early as March. Next slide. A quote about the wait list. So this caregiver had a child in second grade, and they were last in after school in junior kindergarten. So after 3 years of being on the wait list, they were feeling desperate for whatever they can get. Next slide. Um, this quote is about transportation. So for this caregiver, their biggest fear was not having transportation to take their kid from school to the after school program, recognizing that, it's a double benefit for the child and the caregiver. But if you don't have that transportation, there's no one to receive the child, then that actually creates a lot of stress, and it's a big headache for the parent. Next slide. This quote is about special needs. So their child never got off the wait list because the program was never able to hire a full-time aide for them. And so after 3 years, they gave up, and the mom went from full-time to part-time in order to care for their child after school. Next slide. This is also about special needs. So wanting wanting people who are trained to handle a variety of special needs that children have, so that they can feel welcome and fully participate in programs, and just to speak to the variety of different needs that special needs children have, whether it's a learning challenge, behavioral challenge, or medical challenge. Next slide. And this caregiver expressed frustration that there was no trained staff to help her child administer insulin. And so as a result, her child was denied, but after lots of advocacy on her part, and her child was allowed to participate because she was old enough and capable enough to administer her own insulin, but was denied the ability to participate in field trips because there wasn't a way the program could help keep her insulin cold. And so it required a lot of advocacy from the caregiver to enable her child to fully participate. And they were frustrated that it required so much advocacy from them. Next slide. So student and family contacts really influence, their need, what caregivers sort of needed and prioritize. And so student with special needs, especially there was, some feedback about wanting to make sure that all staff, not just, all staff, or at least more than one staff, were trained to be able to accommodate children with special needs. Um, Otherwise, it was difficult for those children to feel welcome and fully participate in programs. And sometimes staffing shortages really hindered the ability for programs to expand their offerings or meet demands, particularly around for special needs students. Um, Families with low income and single caregivers again, really wanted to have that support for their children's education continuity and language acquisition. Um, Managing schedules and logistics for multiple children were really difficult, um, especially for, again, those single caregivers, as well as caregivers who didn't have flexibility in their jobs. The language spoken at home, families whose primary language isn't English, um, also influence their needs and priorities, as well as caregivers who needing to work. Next slide. So in this quote, this caregiver expressed a desire for the lottery to account for single parents, and to have more nuance with the income level. They felt that as a single parent, they shouldn't be lumped in the same income category as a double income high earning family with two doctors. And next slide. So what do caregivers want the city to prioritize for after school programming? So they talked about staffing and training, just making sure that there were enough staff to accommodate all of the students. With staffing shortages, that does affect the ability of programs to take on students, again, especially meeting the needs of special needs students. And then they also express, when there's high turnover, that can lead to some maybe less experienced staff, and then that affected sort of the culture and familiarity that students have with the staff on site. And related to that, health and safety concerns, especially, for that student who needed, insulin, help with the insulin, um, increasing availability of programs as well as the flexibility and options. Um, Caregivers wanted ability to choose the number, which days, as some were not able to, as some didn't need after school care every day. So there was a variety of, both wanting full-time care, but then there are also some who wanted to be able to pick and choose their days. Um, and then having diverse activities for enrichment. Transportation, again, was a really big thing to making sure that, while they had after school care, there was a way for the child to get to their after school. Communication and outreach, again, making sure that there are different ways that uh, caregivers can receive information. And there's one thing about safe recreational spaces that was a little bit outside, but they just wanted to have, more parks and playgrounds. Next slide. So we asked caregivers what was most important to them when selecting an after-school program, and 51% said academic enrichment or homework help. This was a select all that apply question, so these percentages do not add up to 100, but academic enrichment and homework help was a pretty big one, as well as that sports and physical activity. Social enrichment and making friends. And there were also a number of write-ins as well, that so related to, proper care and making sure their child's medical needs were met, having a familiar environment, a familiar friend and teacher so that their child felt emotionally safe was really important. Walkability, full coverage, and for their siblings to attend together were also big. Next slide. So we asked caregivers, what is the primary reason that you enrolled your child in their current after-school program? And 43% of caregivers said that the program schedule fit their family needs. Um, 20% said that it's close to home. And then that other 23%, so 23% selected other, but a lot of people answered this question anyways, even if they didn't select other. And a lot of it was because of proximity to home um, and wanting to make sure that basically, to have homework help, um, getting after school care. So people sort of interpret this question as not the primary reason why you enrolled your child in the current program, but they answered it as, why do you enroll your child in after school? So that 23% is a little bit misleading in the other section. Next slide. Um, so we asked caregivers how many days per week would they utilize or that they would need? And 75% of caregivers said that they would need 5 or 4 day after school program for their kids. So primarily full time. Um, we also we wanted to understand the needs of caregivers who were underutilizing programming. So we sent out a brief poll to caregivers through DHSP to learn about their preferences. And so um, those who prefer there's a proportion of caregivers who preferred 3 days of programming or less, and they also wanted less time per day. So in this quote, again, it shows that caregivers wanted, a variety of options, maybe not wanting 5 days, maybe they just want 3 days, and the ability to choose their days that met their schedule and their needs.
One thing
Next
I
slide.
just want to add is this is the small subset of those caregivers. So these are the folks who we're trying to learn about who are underutilizing programming and they make up, about 15 to 20% of the sample.
Um, and so these are just two quotes from caregivers um, expressing the desire for all kids to have access to programs, expressing the need for more seats. Maybe it's not that they want to make the wait list more pleasant. It's about getting everyone off the wait list and ensuring there are enough seats so that that can be true. Next slide. And just a couple of quotes to summarize, different perspectives from caregivers about, why after school is important or what's important to them. Having that familiar environment, friend and teacher for their kid to help their, feeling emotionally safe. um, a safe place for the kids to stay until the parent can pick them up, making sure that their child's medical needs are being met in after school. They want to make sure that, after school they can protect their kids from screens, opportunities to interact with other children, um, having full coverage, walkability to home, their siblings attending together, strengthening English, and then that academic continuity as well. Next slide. So that concludes our data. We have about 8 minutes left, so I don't know if we have a ton of time for questions, but maybe we can just share a little bit about next steps first.
Yeah, let's do that and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah. So we're going to share the PowerPoint slides in the recording today. I know that we went through a lot real fast, and so if there's any time, if you want to replay or revisit anything, that's there for you, as well as for anyone who wasn't able to make the webinar. We have an in-person meeting on January 21st, and that's really an opportunity for us again to come together and make meaning of this data together. And then we'll come back together again in February to make recommendations and do some action planning based on our meaning making session as well as the data. And then we're compiling a report for the end of February.
Okay. Why don't we open it up with the few moments we have left for questions that people have? Oh, there's a question in the chat from Lissa. Did locations of programming across the city get raised? There are a lot less programs in West Cambridge. I'm surprised that didn't come up. That did not come up as a major theme. It did come up in the principal focus group. Um, an individual principal in that geography raised that, but that did not come up. Trish, I don't think that came up with the caregivers, and that did not come up in the with the teachers either. Is that right? Did you have anything from caregivers on that? Do you remember anything?
Nothing, yeah, nothing from caregivers, but there was one teacher who did mention that there weren't a lot of programmings in there where they were, and I believe that was in West Cambridge. And I actually think they're from the teachers from the same school as that principal.
Okay. All right. Allegra had a question about the age of students who weren't enrolled and whether that played a part in families with multiple children not having a placement in after school for each child, since there is a minimum age requirement for most places.
I'm not sure on that. So when we asked the question, we asked the children they had who were enrolled in K through 8. And so presumably they would have only responded to the question based on the kids who are in K through 8 and not providing information about their children who were in other grade levels. But from my recollection in those caregiver focus groups, and from those who talked about, just the challenges of having multiple children, they were in that K-8 age group.
Other questions that people have? Well, we shared a lot of data with you in a very short period of time, so you might need some time to adjust. We will meet again in person on January 21st, and we will be able to get into in-depth discussion about this data. So we really look forward to that. We appreciate your time today. And for those folks who weren't able to make it today, we will be sharing out the recording so they can watch it. Doing it this way will allow us to have the time in person on the 21st to really focus on the conversations with each other. Then you don't have to be listening to me and Trish. So it's more about you all talking to each other and having really in-depth conversations. That's what we're really looking forward to on the 21st. Yes, and the slides will be shared as well. Any just last final questions before we wrap up or anything else?
Kara, this is Kari. Could I chime in?
Yeah, definitely.
Just real quick. Thanks everybody for being here. Really appreciate you taking time out of the day. Just wanted to reiterate, if it wasn't already clear or didn't come across this time around, that the input, the perspectives, all the work we've done with you all in the advisory group and steering committee spaces are also considered sources of data and perspective. And so, Lissa, your comment is an example, whereas we may not have heard that from the families that we specifically that were part of, the different constellations in terms of the number of programs in different parts of the city, but we have discussed that in other spaces around this and during this research project, including you just bringing it up today. And so that is definitely being weighed as a part of how we think about the overall collection of voices, perspectives, and how we elevate those that are most important and that need to go into the report. So I don't know if there's a technical name for that type of data, but just to say that is also a form of data. I want to be clear. And that includes the next two sessions, of course, in a very major way, which is why we want you to come and be a part of it.
Yes, the next two sessions, thank you, Kari. The next two sessions are really important. They're really going to be creating a lot of the content that's going to go into the final report. So we look forward to that time together with you all. Thank you in advance for committing the time to be able to make it and to bring your valuable perspectives and the time to just look at the data and make meaning of it together.
Kara, just want to say the time for those.
Oh
The
yeah.
the 21st is in person, 10 to 12 at the multipurpose room in the Cambridge Street Upper School, which we've had a lot of meetings in. And then the 6th is actually 11 to 1, same location. And I
Great.
just want to point out that when parents say they want this to be walkable to home, they may not specifically say there's not enough programs in my neighborhood, but when they say they prefer walkable to home, I think that's pretty clear to us. We need to address that concern if we can.
All right. Great. Well, thank you all. Have a great weekend, and we will see you on the 21st.